Welcome to this episode of Intellectual Conservatism. I'm here today with Joe Schmid and Christopher Tomaszewski. This is probably one of the most anticipated conversations that we've had on this page. A lot of people want to see what does Christopher have to say in response to Joe's blog post, and also how's Joe going to critique classical theism. So these are all just really pressing subjects. So let me just have both of them quickly introduce themselves. So let's start with Joe, then go to Christopher. So Joe, introduce yourself.
Well, yeah, first of all, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's so fun just talking with friends about these issues. It's so wonderful. So yeah, I'm Joe. I have a YouTube channel called Majesty of Reason, and I just have philosophers on. I had Rob Koons, Graham Oppie, Felipe Leon, Josh Rasmussen, all that fun stuff. And yeah, just passionate about philosophy, so on. Yeah.
All right, Christopher.
So I'm a PhD student in philosophy at Baylor University. And I don't have a famous YouTube channel or anything like that. But I have a few publications, including one on the modal collapse problem concerning divine simplicity that I think has become fairly popular, or at least relative to the majority of the average number of citations that publications get in philosophy, which is 0. And yeah, I'm just really interested in classical theism and defending it, both from an intellectual point of view and also as a Catholic from a spiritual point of view. I think it's actually spiritually important that people believe not just theism and Christianity, but also classical theism. So I am interested in doing these kinds of public engagements where I can make these arguments accessible and hopefully defend them for folks who maybe aren't that well versed in philosophy.
All right. So for the format for today's discussion, we're going to begin by first talking about realism and Platonism. We'll have Joe present the problem that he believes this poses for classical theism. Christopher will respond. The second point will be on securing monotheism. We're going to divide that up into whether or not classical theism gets us to only one God in principle, and then Joe will present his objections from the Trinity, or his hesitations. And then we'll go finally to extrinsic change and deal with whether or not it's compatible with divine simplicity, and specifically the hypostatic union. I'll have Christopher lead the final part, since he's going to make the case that the two are compatible. So with that being said, each of these will be divided into 30-minute segments. We have 3 kind of larger segments. So, Joe wanted us to be conscientious about time, so I'll try my best. And with that being said, Joe, can you present to us what is the problem with Platonism and classical theism?
Yeah, definitely. So just a few preliminaries. So I didn't prepare anything formal for this. So I'm just viewing this as a sort of fun discussion where we're sort of interrogating the nature of reality together with one another. So that's really how I'm viewing this. The second preliminary is just that I don't really like to see arguments as sort of like weapons or like knockdown things that can like decisively show something. They're more so like tools for exploration and tools for probing reality. So merely by presenting some sort of problem, I certainly don't want people to think that it's some sort of like inescapable thing, or that there are no good responses or what have you. The debate and discussion will continue on and so on. So those are my 2 preliminaries. But basically, the discussion concerning realism and Platonism really boils down to, well, one aspect of it is aseity. So God is supposed to be radically independent of everything, and moreover, under classical theism, everything apart from God is supposed to have its being sourced in God, in God's creative activity. And I would think, and I think different authors like Michael Bergman, Boiler Up, and who was his co-author? Jeff Brower, I think, both Boiler Up. But they both have a nice paper on the truth makers and divine simplicity, that truth maker account of divine simplicity, and arguing for that account actually on the basis of the incompatibility of Platonism with classical theism. And so what I'm sort of getting at here isn't really isn't quite novel, and it also has precedent in other prominent classical theistic thinkers, and other theists really think that Platonism, if true, would probably be a challenge for theists. So what is this challenge? Well, basically, under classical theism, right, everything that has being, right, is either being itself, which is God, or derives its being from the sort of creative bestowal of esse or being by God, right? And so if there are these eternal, necessary, uncreated Platonic abstracta, right, well then that characterization of classical theism is false, right? Because these Platonic abstracta aren't created by God, but everything apart from God is supposed to be created by God. Now, I'm not going to assert that Platonism is true. I'm just trying to show how there's a problem for basically all theists. Another aspect of this debate that's super important is really to ask not only about Platonism, but the metaphysical or ontological status of abstracta themselves, right? And so I'll sort of be taking on certain realist intuitions concerning, abstracta and numbers, propositions, and so on. And some of these realist intuitions are, well, number one, abstracta are typically thought of, right, as like necessarily existent. That is to say, they cannot fail to exist. So for instance, the number 2, it just doesn't really seem to be the sort of thing that could exist on Friday, but like not on other days, or like it only exists in the Milky Way galaxy, but not in the Andromeda galaxy or anything, right? 2 seems to have this sort of robust necessary existence if it exists at all. And so similarly, like 1 + 1 equaling 2, that simply just couldn't be false. It's right. It's like necessarily true. Like 1 + 1 couldn't make anything other than 2. And similar intuitions, I think, support the necessary existence of essences like propositions, shapes, universals, or properties, and so on. And again, like we can set aside nominalism in debates that, that kind of cast doubt on these realist intuitions. But that's one of the realist intuitions. And there are actually different arguments for the necessary existence of propositions, but we can't get into those now because those are a bit too technical. But a second realist intuition, and then I'll try to close off this portion of my presentation. The second realist intuition is just that it also seems equally obvious, right, that the number 2 is really distinct from the number 7, right? Like while both might necessarily exist, they are not really identical with one another. I mean, 2 is even, right, but 7 is not even. 2 is the first prime number, 7 is not the first prime number. And so not only are these numbers like not identical to other numbers, but like numbers are also really, surely they aren't identical to propositions, right? Numbers can't be true or false, but propositions can. Numbers don't have intentionality, but propositions are sort of about things, right? They sort of represent things. And so, and also like triangularity, right? Like triangularity isn't identical to the human essence, which also isn't identical to the number 2, and so on. So we have these 2 realist intuitions that, number 1, these things are necessarily existent, but number 2, they're really distinct. And so this sort of poses a problem, right? We have these really distinct metaphysically necessary things, and these things are either going to be intrinsic to God or extrinsic to God. Now, if they're intrinsic to God, well then it seems as though God wouldn't be absolutely simple, right? Because then there would be really distinct things within God, but which are not identical to God, right? But the classical formulation of the doctrine of simplicity is whatever is in God is God. I think that's Augustine, and that's what Bill Vallicella has on his Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy page as sort of like the sort of formula for it. So if these things are truly really distinct, then they must really be extrinsic to God. If they are these distinct existences, they're going to have to be extrinsic to God. But, right, we also found that anything apart from God has its being sourced in God's free creative act. And that means that it's not necessary that there exists anything distinct from and hence, right, extrinsic to God. And that just contradicts the realist intuitions. There's a fly right here. That contradicts the realist intuitions we saw earlier, which get us to the sort of really distinct metaphysically necessary things that are extrinsic to God. So, okay, so that's the problem. And I can turn it over to you guys to see what you guys, where you want to take it from here.
All right, so I'm going to have Christopher respond, and also Joe. I'm just kind of moderating in the background. I don't know if you want me to hop in or at all, but I think I want it to be between you and Joe. Excuse me, you and Christopher.
It's all
so
cool.
Christopher, you go ahead.
Sure. So I think what Joe just said largely mirrors what he had to say in the blog post that replied to the video that Swan, that you hosted with me and Gavin. And I see that it looks like there's 2 criticisms there of a comment that I had made in the video, namely, to the effect that there's, when you deny classical theism, you find folks like William Lane Craig, doing book-length treatments about how we're going to reconcile realism about abstracta with the aseity of God and the freedom of his creative activity. And Joe kind of made 2 points there. I think the first one was, look, if Platonism is true, that's a problem for everybody. And I agree with that entirely. I'll go a step further. Like, if Platonism is true, then Thomistic classical theism is false, and it just is. But I qualify there to note Thomistic classical theism because, of course, I want to count Plato himself in the classical theist tradition, and I think most people do. Yeah, if Platonism about necessary abstracta is true, then Joe's absolutely right. Like, that's not just a problem for Thomistic classical theism. It just outright contradicts it. So, of course, what Thomistic classical theists are committed to saying is that Platonism is false, and of course that then places upon them the burden of how to accommodate the realist intuitions about abstracta without contradicting what they want to say about the aseity and simplicity of God. And of course, that project begins well before Thomas. That goes all the way back to Augustine, if not earlier. So, there's a tradition beyond Thomas of classical theists struggling with this problem. I guess the point that I was just making, right, is that Thomistic classical theism is supposed to be a moderately realist middle way between what Thomists are certainly going to take to be the errors of Platonism and nominalism on either side of that middle way, and that if it's rejected, if Thomistic classical theism is rejected, as people like William Lane Craig are inclined to do, then you have to start choosing between aseity and nominalism, or sorry, not aseity and nominalism, aseity and realism about abstracta. And what I want to say is that Thomistic classical theists and other, not necessarily Thomistic, any kind of robust divine conceptualist needn't make that hard choice. We don't have to make that hard choice. So that's just by way of explanation, I guess, of the comment in the previous video that sparked Joe's criticism here. Now, of course, Joe has a more robust criticism here, namely that Thomistic classical theists face a particular difficulty in saying that the divine ideas are identical to God but distinct from each other. Now, there was a crucial word that Joe used and of course, I take Joe's explanation of that to be perfectly adequate. But there was a crucial word that Joe used there that I think the Thomistic classical theists can pull on and bring the whole argument down, and that word is really distinct. Aquinas does not say, I think other classical theists are not going to want to say, for the reasons that Joe gave, that the divine ideas are really distinct. We're going to want to say they are conceptually or virtually distinct. Where by virtually distinct, we just mean they're distinct only posterior to some mental activity on the part of a conceptualizing agent, but the distinction being conceptualized is grounded in the reality of the thing. In other words, that the reality of God is such that when we distinguish between the divine ideas, between the various ways in which God can be finitely imitated, we aren't just giving names to God, like we might give the names morning star and evening star to the planet Venus. We are actually tracking the content of the divine essence in a way that that distinction is not really present there prior to mental activity, but the conceptual distinction is tracking something, is tracking the content of the divine essence. And so I think that's perfectly consistent with Thomistic classical theism, in part because we don't deny all distinctions in God. To be more precise, we deny only absolute real distinctions in God. Now, the real distinction part is the reason why we deny the real distinctions has to do with this divine idea stuff and other attributes of God, we don't want to say that God's mercy is really distinct from his justice. And we also have to have that qualification in there, absolute, because we do recognize some real distinctions in God, namely the distinctions between the persons of the Trinity. So I think, right, once we get this better grasp on what exactly the classical theist denies in terms of distinctions in God, namely the absolute real distinctions, then we can be perfectly fine admitting a wide variety, indeed an infinite variety of conceptual or virtual distinctions. And these are the kinds of distinctions we want to make between the divine ideas. And I don't think it can be said either that the divine ideas must be really distinct from each other, precisely because the divine ideas are ideas or concepts. And for ideas or concepts, an ideal or conceptual distinction suffices. You don't need a real distinction between ideal entities. You just need an ideal distinction or a conceptual distinction or a virtual distinction, however you want to exactly state it. So I mean, right, after all, they're only concepts, right? And concepts need only be conceptually distinct. And it's only res, not abstracta, that need to be really distinct. I mean, after all, the view is called divine conceptualism, not divine Platonic realism. So in a certain way, I think what we are doing here is we're retreating from Platonic realism, to be sure. And if you take Platonism about ideas to be the gold standard of realism, then I guess we're also retreating from the strongest versions of realism about the divine ideas as well. This is why I think Thomism about divine ideas and divine conceptualism more generally is usually classified by scholars as a moderately realist view about the divine ideas. So I'll stop there and let Joe respond.
All right, Joe, go ahead.
Yeah, no, okay, so thank you so much. Bringing up some really good points. So I guess one way to start off by way of response is really thinking about how I'm approaching this. And so it's sort of like a modest approach, right? I'm taking these intuitions that we have and then bringing out attention, right? And so, I mean, one way to go about, avoiding this sort of predicament or problem, as it were, is to, I guess, cast away one or more of those intuitions. And I do think that that's what ultimately Christopher is doing, right? So I pinpointed basically two central of these realist intuitions. The first one was that, these things are metaphysically necessary. So like two is metaphysically necessary. Triangularity is metaphysically, the fly has returned, man. Triangularity is metaphysically necessary. And things like that, like propositions and so on, like necessarily true propositions. So that's the first realist intuition. The second realist intuition was that these things are like really distinct. Like it is really the case in reality, like in extramental reality, not how we conceptualize extramental reality. It is really the case that the number 2 is not the number 7. It is really the case that propositions are not numbers. And it is really the case that essences are not numbers and so on, and not propositions as well. And so that's sort of the second realist intuition. I do think that there are some, pretty powerful arguments from like Leibniz's law that we could get into even for that, right? I mean, like propositions have intentionality and they could be true or false, but it seems to me not to make sense to say like 2 could be true or false. Like what? 2 could 2 be true or false? Like, I don't know. It doesn't really make sense. And like, what is 2 about? Like, it doesn't seem to be about anything, whereas propositions seem to be about things. And this really isn't a fact about how we conceptualize propositions and how we think about the number 2. It's really a fact about number 2 and the fact about propositions. And so if we really get that these things are metaphysically necessary and that they are really distinct in sort of extramental reality, not merely how we sort of conceptualize them, then it does seem as though we get this sort of problem. Now we can sort of, I guess, bracket these off and say like, okay, well, fine, they're not really distinct, but they're still part of the concepts of God or something, like concepts within the divine mind there, or they have a sort of ideal or intentional existence or conceptual existence. But then I'm starting to I'm starting to lose my grasp as to how we have preserved that second realist intuition. And remember, my goal is a modest goal. It's really, if we accept those two realist intuitions, then it seems as though we generate this problem. And so I do think that, yeah, the classical theist can reject one or more of those two intuitions, but then, you might pay certain prices for rejecting those. And so that's I do have a lot more to say about like ideal entities and like conceptual and virtual distinctions and so on. But I think we can just pause on this point, and I can turn it over to Christopher for that.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sure. Okay, so yeah, I think I want to make two clarifications. One is, right, so Joe came back to this point of noting like, no, look, it's not just posterior to my mental conception of two that it's distinct from seven. That's how two really is. And I'm a mathematician, so I definitely want that to end up being something like that to end up being the case. And I think Joe's intuition there is right. I think what's happening there is we're getting tied up on what the classical theist means by really distinct as opposed to conceptually or virtually distinct. So what I want to say is that it's just it's a category mistake to even want a real distinction between things like 2 and 7. Why? Well, because 2 and 7 are ideas. They're abstracta. And now, of course, if you adopt a Platonic position, then you're going to think that they're not just ideas, they're also res up in Plato's heaven. Now, the challenge for adopting that view is to explain what explanatory advantage that provides, right, over the people who think, no, 2 and 7 are just ideas. They're not real. They're just concepts. They only exist in intellects or as instantiated in real things, and so on. So what I want to say, right, is that seeking a real distinction between 2 and 7 is a category mistake because they're not real things to begin with. And it's a category mistake to seek real distinctions between things that aren't real. And now here's the second clarification I want to make. When I say that they're not real, I don't mean they're imaginary. I don't mean they're fake. I don't mean they don't exist. I mean that they only exist in intellects or as instantiated in res. So, real is not the antonym of false or imaginary. Real is the antonym of ideal, which is another way of existing, right? But a way of existing that can happen only in intellects or only insofar as they do have real existence, it's only as instantiated in a thing. And of course, when we're talking about 2 or 7, we're not talking about 2 coconuts or 7 coconuts or 2 dogs or 7 dogs. We're talking about 2 simplicator. And that thing only exists in intellects. The general concept outside of any instantiation in real things is an idea. It's not real. And therefore, it's a category mistake, I think, to want real distinctions between them. And for this reason, I think it's also true that, like, Leibniz's law worries aren't going to really be a big deal either, because, right, since 2 and 7 aren't real identity, aren't real entities, they also don't have anything really true of them prior to what's true of them as in an intellect. And of course, it's worth noting that when I say that, I'm not advocating some kind of subjectivism where whatever is true of 2, whatever you think of 2 is true of it. There really are objective facts about 2 and 7, but those objective facts are grounded in the divine essence ultimately. But they only are true of the ideas because that's all there are. There are no real entities answering to the name 2 or 7. 2 and 7 are the names of ideas that are grounded in the divine essence.
Yeah, for some odd reason, Joe, on your end, like there was like some feedback, and then I could hear Christopher's. That. Yeah, so I muted your mic. We have about 9 minutes left, so just keep that in mind. Yeah.
Okay. No, yeah, thank you for those clarifications. I do think they help. So there are so there are two different ways that I could go at this I guess juncture, as it were. So one of them is to look at different arguments that realists offer, or okay, maybe like Platonists, but I guess I could I'll bracket the question of Platonism, but I'll just talk about realists. Two different arguments, or like different arguments that realists can offer with respect to actually attributing certain properties to these things, such that it could generate arguments for their actually like real existence, as opposed to sort of mere conceptual and so on. That's one way, and I think that would get us way too deep into the weeds, because that would take us into like Josh Rasmussen's argument for the propositions and them having like sort of necessary truth, and how you can infer necessary existence from that. And I do think that once we get certain properties going, I do think that there would have to be some sort of rest that like instantiates or has those properties in some form or other. But that, I think that would get us way too far into the weeds. So I'm going to take the second response that I'm going to be thinking about in relation to what Christopher said. So he sort of made this distinction between the real versus the conceptual or ideal existence, and the not real, of course, didn't mean like fake or like non-existent in the way that Santa. I mean, I haven't been to the North Pole, but I'm pretty sure he's not real. Although, I mean, what would explain those presents? But anyway, I'm being stupid. Oh man. Okay, but anyway, so this not real. The sort of the corollary of it was only exists in intellects, right? So it's real versus sort of only exists in intellects. But I guess I'm still wondering how we are accommodating this second realist intuition, because while like I could probably grant that yes, they only exist in intellects, perhaps, but even if they only exist in intellects, there are still these really distinct some things, right? I don't want to say things, but these really distinct X's, right? Let's just use just variables. These really distinct X's that exist in intellect. So even though they still have an intellectual existence, this realist intuition seems to be pushing me, at least personally, it seems to push my sight into thinking that, well, even if they only exist in the intellects, there's still going to be these really distinct X's that are within God's intellect. And I struggle to see how that is actually ultimately going to be preserving divine simplicity, because there are going to be these like, really, in order to preserve this second realist intuition, there are going to be these really distinct X's, such that although they only exist in intellects and so are not sort of real in Plato's heaven, there's still going to be this puzzle for divine simplicity. So I'll turn it over to you to see what you think about that.
Right. I mean, I think we're getting close to rock bottom here. I mean, I think it's almost well, so right. I think it's almost yeah, I think I do want to say this. It's an analytic truth about something's existing in the intellect that it's not real. That's part of what it means for it to not for it to exist in the intellect. When I say that something only exists in my intellect and not outside of that, or for that matter, only exists in the divine intellect and in God's way of thinking about his own essence. That means it's not real. I mean, so I guess, and so I also agree with your point that like, well, right. I mean, I think you said something in this direction, which is right. Look, what you really need to do to, I think, settle this is to explain like what and maybe some of the arguments you had mentioned earlier go to this, and maybe, I don't know, at some later date when we both have the time, we can get more into this. What exactly the advantage is supposed to be that positing the ideas as res, as Platonism does, is supposed to have over divine conceptualism, right? I mean, I guess that as I see it, right, divine conceptualism enables our concepts to do all the work we want them to do, right? 2 can be even and 7 can be odd, and so on, without having to posit real distinctions between them. We can do all the work with just conceptual distinctions. So then I guess the ball is back into the court of the Platonists to explain why these things have to have extra mental reality in order to do the kind of work we want our ideas to do. Now, of course, one thing you kind of want them to do, I think, is you want them to be the forms of things, right? So, in Plato, he refers to the res in his heaven as both ideas and forms, and so you want, in some sense, the divine ideas to be informing the natures of things. The divine idea of man should be telling us something, not only telling us something about what man is like, but should in some sense be informing the very nature of man. So I think that's where Aristotle comes in, and he says, well, look, it's not the ideas only exist in intellects, but forms can also be instantiated really in things, in such a way that the intellect can pull that form back out through experience with the object and cognizing it. So there's that one thing you would want divine ideas to be doing, but I think Aristotelian Thomism gets you that, because we don't, ideas only exist in the intellect, but they also get instantiated really in things. All we're denying is that there would be a separated idea, something that's not existing really in the sublunar world, right? Which is also not existing in an intellect, right? So it's one or the other, right? It's either in an intellect, if it's not real, or if it is really instantiated, it's really instantiated in a concretum, in a hylomorphic composite, so to speak.
All right, 2 minutes left.
Sure. So just to wrap up, I guess, right, all I want to say about that is we would have to see, right, I would want to know what Platonism is, get the explanatory advantage it's giving us over divine conceptualism.
Okay, yeah, no, that's good. So I'll basically just give a 1 minute response to what you said, and then yeah, we'll see what we could do from there. So I do think we would probably get into the weeds a bit too quickly, especially for a 1 minute response, by going into like all of the Platonism stuff and the different advantages you might get. And I do think it actually might hinge on the different arguments that you would level for realism, whether or not these properties require some sort of rest or what have you. But I'll table that. And for this other aspect of my 60-second response, I guess we might be able to look at, just for the audience, to look at this issue maybe in a different lens. So to think of the thought versus an intentional object of the thought. So God, of course, has a thought, and that thought is his being, and so on, and it has different intentional objects, right? And so it almost sounds like you're saying that these different abstracta are just different intentional objects of God's thought. But then, I don't know, it seems to me that, well, they either sort of exist, right? That, like, they either are in reality or not in reality. And if they're in reality, then it seems as though there's going to be some sort of existing real distinction, even if it's in the intentional objects of God's thought, but they're still going to be intrinsic to him, because, we can consider these abstracta in a world in which God exists alone, for instance, or something. Yeah, it still seems to me that there's going to be that sort of real distinction even among the existing intentional objects of the thoughts. Whereas if we say that they don't exist, then I'm just like, well, then how on earth are the intentional objects of thought if they're literally nothing, right? It's almost as though you haven't even told me that they're an intentional object of the thought. Anyway, that was about my minute and a half response.
10 seconds left if Chris
yeah,
want to take
so
it.
I'll just say, right, like the inference from not real to doesn't literally exist is what I was trying to deny earlier. When, right? I mean, I guess if you just define real in the way that I think you are, right, as being the contrary of non-existent, or of being the contrary of non-existent, then basically, I'd have to just go in and use that term to retweak the entire theory of divine simplicity and say, yeah, there are some real distinctions in God, given Joe Schmid's definition of real, right? That's what I would do. It would be equivalent to the current theory. It would just be using your definition of real.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that we're kind of sort of close to hitting a bedrock, but yeah, we can go on. I mean, I would still say that they would exist. Like, there's some sense in which they exist, even if they're intentional objects of thought. But anyway.
Yeah, I agree. There's some sense in which they really exist. There's some sense in which they exist, or they really exist in the way you're using it. I just deny that they exist in. They are real entities in Aquinas's or other classical theists' sense of real.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but we're over time, so I won't respond.
Yeah, I was having a blast, but yeah, I might have to give Joe like an extra 30 seconds next time or something, just to even it out,
Sure.
For fairness sake. Well, actually, now it's Christopher's turn to introduce his argument Now we're in the second section, that classical theism secures monotheism. And I don't think I need to read the quote back to you, Christopher, but I think you get the general gist of what the argument was. So I'll let you present it. I'll divide this into 15 minutes here and then 15 minutes to the Trinity.
Sure. Yeah, I'll make this pretty brief because I'm sure Joe knows what I'm talking about here. The idea is just right, that divine simplicity provides us a sure foundation for the uniqueness of God, right? Because one of the things that divine simplicity does, among other things, is it identifies God with his nature. So the way Aquinas would put that, right, is there's no distinction in God between the supposit, i.e. the individual. I'm slurring the concept there a little bit, but the individual and the nature. God is divinity, and right. So, and since God is divinity, right, you couldn't have another God who was also identical to divinity. For if you had that, then you'd have, by the transitivity of real identity, you would have the gods would be identical to each other. Right. So, I mean, I'm not suggesting that's the only way to secure God's uniqueness. I think there are other ways in which divine simplicity does that, namely, for example, by identifying God with goodness itself, which I think has appeal outside of the classical tradition. I mean, so part of what might be interesting to hear from Joe is like, look, the divine simplicity denies a variety of different kind of distinctions in God. Which ones are you really wanting to reject? So that might be helpful to hear back from Joe. But just to complete the idea here, another way I think it gets is, identifying God with being itself, or identifying God with existence, his own existence, and so on. And if you have this, then obviously, right, you get a pretty secure monotheism. And I don't think there's no knockdown argument I can give right now that that people who deny classical theism have no resources to do the same. But that seems like a really simple way, and it's not clear to me that there's any equally simple way of doing it without divine simplicity. So my idea here, just to start off with, is I guess it's an easy and I think very secure way to a firm monotheism.
All right, Joe.
Yeah, no, thank you. Yeah, this stuff is so interesting because it's like you're talking about nature and identity. I love this stuff. Wonderful. So I guess there are different ways that one can respond to this. So one sort of path or avenue is to show that, like non-classical theists have other quite secure ways to secure monotheism. And so in my blog post, I talked about a few different ways, maybe like, I think I talked about the nature of perfection. And then, so that's one path. And then another path is to look at this particular argument that Christopher is giving and to say like, well, hold on a second, this argument might not work, or it might have certain difficulties here and there. And so I guess I'll start with that second path. So one thing is just that I think there might be a slight sort of ambiguity in when we say that God would be identical to his divinity, and if there could be two beings, well, then they would both have to be identical to that divinity, and hence by the transitivity of identity they'd be, or the transitivity of real identity, they'd be identical to one another. So I do think there might be a slight ambiguity here when we say that divinity, right? So are we talking about that divinity that the God of classical theism, the first God, as it were, that we're thinking of, are we talking about that nature of divinity? Or, because yeah, in that case, if this God is such that it's identical to this nature of divinity, then anything which also would be identical to this nature of divinity would be identical to that God, such that there's only one God here, right? But there's also this further question as to whether or not there could be a second distinct nature from this divinity that is also a divine nature, which is such that a different God, G2, could be identical with its nature, right? And so then we have two different gods here with their own divine natures. And it seems to me that it's difficult, to my mind, to see how we could sort of in a non-question begging way slide from one sense of that divinity to the other, so as to preserve the soundness of Christopher's argument. And so the way that I put this in the blog post was basically like, I think I said something like, even if God G1, right, that I was considering, is identical with its nature, and God G2 is identical with its nature, like it wouldn't really follow merely from that their nature is thereby one and the same. Their natures could still be distinct, like period. They could just be different divine natures. And, you know, perhaps we could cash this out in terms of some sort of primitive hexaity, like an individual thisness of divinity, or what have you. Or perhaps it's just two different distinct things such that they're both identical to that divine nature that they each possess. So yeah, I'm wondering how we can really bridge that gap to saying, when we say this divine nature, are we sort of designating this one in particular, like only this divine nature? In which case, it seems to me that we're sort of building in the conclusion in the start, because we're only talking about this nature, and we're precluding, even in principle, the possibility of there being this other nature such that this God is identical to that nature. So that I won't pursue that second path, because that would be a mouthful. So I'll turn it over to Christopher to see what he thinks about that sort of line of response.
Sure. Can I just say as a clarificatory question, mostly for my own curiosity, before I get to my response of you, Joe, and that is, do you, I mean, so like I said before, there's lots of entailments of divine simplicity. Do you think there's something particularly incoherent about identifying God with his nature? Or are you like, okay, well, no, I mean, that entailment of divine simplicity is okay?
I'm not sure. I haven't read the literature on that. So I'm fine with that at this moment. Like, I don't see
Okay.
any coherence. Like, I don't really like this sort of Plantingian thing, like, oh, he'd be identical with a property, and hence he wouldn't be concrete, and hence he wouldn't have causal power. You know? So
Right, right.
I don't like that type of response. And yeah, so
Okay.
I guess I'm in principle okay with it. But I'd have to look at the literature just to
Okay.
see.
Okay, so let me respond. So right, I mean, to me, your response sounds like just biting the bullet, and in a certain sense, like, yeah, and this is the reason why. You say, okay, well, there could just be a separate God who's identical to his nature, and no real identity between the two relevant divine natures. But that seems to me to be just to concede that the second God would not be God, capital G, or that one of them wouldn't be, right? I mean, what it would, and in particular, because words in the abstract designate natures, it would amount to an equivocation to say that they're both God in the same sense if their nature isn't the same, right? In the same way as it would clearly be an equivocation to say that you know, that me and some lion are both men, even though we both have different we have different natures. Why? Well, because man designates a certain kind of nature. So when you attribute that nature to me, you're saying I have a certain. When you say Christopher is a man, you're attributing a certain kind of nature to me, the nature that is named humanity, or you know, man, if you take it in the abstract. And the lion doesn't have that nature, right? So if you call the lion a man, you are just, I mean, you could do that, but you'd be using the term man equivocally from how you used it when you called me a man. And it seems to me that if you admit that one God is God only equivocally, that you've conceded he's not God in the sense that anybody cares about.
Yeah. Okay, so it seems to me that it's not quite biting the bullet, right? So sure, I mean, we can talk about you and the lion, but we can also talk about two things that in some sense fall into one kind, as it were. Like, you and I are both have like the property man, or whatever, however you want to spell that out. We can spell it out in Aristotelian terms or Platonic terms or whatever. But we have that nature. Now, of course, there's some sort of thing that can serve as a principle of individuation between us, like whether it's like you know, the matter that we're tied to, or what have you. But it seems to me that, like, why couldn't there be in addition some sort of principle of distinction such that it accounts for these two different beings, and that's now we're actually bleeding into the Trinitarian thing,
Well,
because well, let me just finish for this little part.
yeah.
That it seems to me that identity, and this is actually what a lot of people have thought when they're thinking about the not Leibniz's law, but the identity of indiscernibles. So not the indiscernibility of identicals, but the identity of indiscernibles or whatever. So if two things share all and only the same properties, does it follow from that they are identical? And actually, a lot of philosophers, when they reflect on this, they've come to the conclusion to think that distinctness is sort of primitive, because if we're trying to locate or ground distinctness in something else, well, then in some sense it's already presupposing that there's a distinctness between them, because if X and Y were in fact identical, right, then there actually couldn't be such a principal distinction. So a lot of philosophers have thought that distinctness between two things is sort of primitive, and if that's the case, well, then we wouldn't really require some sort of principle or principle of individuation between these two divine natures, because they could just be primitively distinct. It's just a sort of necessary truth, and there isn't sort of this one principle. One of them isn't really tied to matter, while the other one is tied to a different kind of matter. So I could go down different paths, like with Trinitarianism as a principle of distinction, like if the other one could be Binitarian, but we can table that for the second 15 minutes. But the first one, I guess, is just like this sort of primitive distinctness that philosophers have come up with when they're thinking about the identity of indiscernibles.
Yep, 4 minutes left for this topic.
Right. Yeah, so let's say that there could be primitive distinctness. I mean, so that seems to cut, I guess that seems to help me, right? Because then I don't even have to say exactly what it is that makes the distinct gods distinct. I can just say, yeah, there's just distinct gods. Now, but even if distinction was primitive, it would still follow that if God is identical to his nature, and something else is also identical to that nature, then God is identical to that thing. Even if right? I mean, that principle is true even if distinction is primitive, right? Because it's one thing to say that distinction is primitive, and quite another to say that things can be distinct even if they're really identical to some third thing. Both really identical to some third thing. The latter claim is way stronger. And it's that latter claim on which the argument that I've given relies. And so even if you could have this primitive distinctness, so much the worse for I guess anybody who wants to say there's only one God, and that there's no principle by which to distinguish. There's no principle by which to distinguish that God from any other. But I have a positive argument.
Yeah, no, I like the response. So one thing that it still seems to me that there's this sort of subtle ambiguity when you said, and again, in that what you just presented, you said that nature, right? So I guess I should be more clear when I say the gods are primitively distinct. When we're identifying them with their own natures, it's when I'm sort of talking about their natures that are primitively distinct. So we can't really say that nature, because then we're already sort of building in from the start that we're only talking about this one, and these two different gods are sort of, trying to latch onto that nature, as it were. I know it's a horrible metaphor, but so yeah. So basically, I was trying to locate this primitive distinctness on the level of the nature, such that this God is identical to this nature, this God's identical to this nature, and the natures themselves are sort of primitively distinct, but both divine. And I guess another thing that you touched on, which is actually a really good point, is just that this might cut against, or this might be a problem, as it were, for all theists. Now, what I think about that is that my criticism here is basically along the lines of, for all this particular argument shows, this could be the case. And so that's all I'm trying to establish with respect to this argument. Now, what I just said, for all this argument shows this could be the case, that's compatible with leveling different bolstering arguments like from perfection, which I actually think could be pretty powerful, which is that second avenue by which I could criticize this argument that we haven't really gone down with respect to perfection, because I do think perfection kind of points to uniqueness. But I guess we were at the 15-minute mark, so we might want to switch into that Trinitarian. I know I got the last word, but it was sort of like
that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, we have 30 seconds left if anybody wants to take it.
Yeah, I'll just say this. I mean, there's in some sense, I think some primitives I'm okay with. Primitive, I mean, one other problem I think you're going to run into, besides equivocation with attributing a primitive distinctness, is that you're going to have a brute fact about how many divine natures there are. You're either going to have a brute fact about how many divine natures there are, or you're going to make some of them ontologically prior to others. Either is problematic.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. If you don't adduce further arguments, it would probably be rude. And that's why I really want to emphasize that, like, for all this argument shows such and such. So we could level different arguments and so on. But I know we're at time, so sorry.
No, you're good. I mean, if you want to count that as part of your 30 extra seconds or whatever, yeah.
That's cool with me. I don't care.
All right, sure. All right, then now to the Trinity. So Joe, present your objection, and then we'll hear Christopher's response.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So this is a second way. So remember, in my first go at this argument, I basically divided up the strategies for responding to it in two different camps, right? The first one was to tackle sort of this argument, as it were, and to show some difficulties for it. And the second one was to show, like, well, hey, non-classical theists have all these other secure ways to, secure monotheism. So those are the two different ways. This Trinitarianism one is also within this first, or within this avenue. That's not really the other ways. It's trying to tackle sort of this argument. So it's still along that same general path. So I just wanted to say that as a sort of preliminary. I guess with that preliminary out of the way, I guess I would argue that I don't really see an argument in principle. And again, sight is based on different people. So other people see different things that, other people don't see at different times. So I'm just speaking from my own sight, right? So from my own sight, it seems to me that at least in principle, right, we cannot, for all this argument shows, and at least in principle, there could be a principle of individuation between two different divine beings, such that this one is identical to its nature, this one is identical to its nature, and what accounts for how they're different, right? We don't even need to go to the primitive route. What accounts for how they're different is that this one is Trinitarian, whereas this one is binitarian, for instance, which is just means it has two divine persons intrinsic to it instead of three. Or it could be Unitarian, for instance. It could be a sort of how Maimonides and Averroes and how they sort of conceive of the classical theist God. And so at least for all this argument shows, those are the two caveats. For all this argument shows, and at least in principle, it seems as though there could be a sort of Unitarian or binitarian or tetratarian or pentatarian or what have you, and then this Trinitarian God. And so they would both be absolutely simple, right? They would both be identical to their own natures and so on. And this one would be Trinitarian. That could account for their distinction, because there's something true of one that isn't true of the other. Namely, this one has three divine persons intrinsic to it. This one has no divine persons intrinsic to it, because it's a Unitarian, or guess one person. But that's sort of the general thrust of the presentation of that criticism. So I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good. Okay, so let me say first, address something that you said toward the end. Here's one way to obtain the distinction. And perhaps one of the divine natures is Unitarian, and one of them is Trinitarian, or whatever numbers you like. So I mean, I think this is to confuse the order of explanation between distinction and things having different properties. It's because things are distinct that they can have different properties, not that they're distinct because they have different properties. So if we say, it's not that when you say that one God is Unitarian and one God is Trinitarian, for example, you're showing a distinction. You're showing they can't possibly be the same, or one divine nature is Unitarian, one divine nature is Trinitarian. You're showing that they are distinct, but you're not positing a principle of individuation, right? Having different properties is not a principle of individuation. It's something that flows from the individuation. It flows from the distinction. It makes it possible for these things to have distinct properties. So let me say that first, and then get my train of thought here. Oh, right. Okay. So I think the whole, the possibility of a Unitarian divine nature versus a Trinitarian divine nature, bracketing questions about why I think the Trinity is necessary that would take us too far afield, doesn't actually touch the point I guess the central point I was making, which is, look, I'll grant you the distinction of the natures. It seems like you're arguing for the possibility of there being such distinct natures. I'm happy to grant you that. Have it. There's distinct natures there, right? And each God is identical to each God there is identical to his nature, but the natures are distinct from each other. My central reply to that was that, because substantial predicates signify natures, you would then basically be equivocating by calling them both God, just as you'd be equivocating by calling a lion a man, and right, and once you admit that you're equivocating and calling them both God, you're admitting that they're not really both the God that we're after. Now, you could say, one way of replying to that is to say, well, they both participate in some even higher nature. That each of their divinities is a species of, if you will. But then it seems like, well, especially if you have the kind of, if you've gotten the identity of the God with his nature in the first place, it seems like that higher nature is actually the real God, right? Especially if it's going to have the kind of principles of intellect and will that make the lower two gods that are distinct from each other be persons, or one person, three persons, whatever. That higher nature is also going to have intellect and will, be personal, and therefore be a God in the relevant sense. And once you see that, it seems like it's the real God, and these guys down here that who have divinities that are identical to divinities that are species of this genus are, nothing more than demiurges.
Yeah, no, those are two good points. So the first one, you talked about how different properties sort of flow from, as it were, the sort of prior real distinction between them, right? And so it's sort of getting the explanatory order wrong. And actually, I actually think that that's correct, and that's sort of what I was hinting at earlier when I was talking about the indiscernibility of identicals, right? Like them even having different properties would sort of already presuppose their distinction, and this is what really leads philosophers to think that it's sort of primitive. So I don't know, it seems to me that that actually goes to bolster some of the arguments that I was leveling earlier based on sort of primitive distinction between them. So that was my first thought in regard to that.
Well, sorry, just to interrupt. Like I said, I'm happy to grant the distinction between them. I think it's irrelevant. Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that's why I was going to go on to talk about the principle of individuation, right? So I guess it might also depend on why we were talking about the principle of or what we mean by a principle of individuation, right? Because X and Y can only have some sort of principle of individuation between them. It's the same sort of reasoning in the case of different properties, right? X and Y can only have a principle of individuation between them if they are in fact identical, or if they are in fact distinct in the first place. And so it seems as though even this principle of individuation is such that it couldn't really do it justice. We'd still have to get to that primitive distinctness at the bottom. And I know you said you could grant that in how different properties would sort of flow from that primitive distinctness. But I guess the criticism really boils down to the primitive distinctness, and how that in and of itself seems to me to constitute a defeater, as it were, not like a sense in like, oh, I've defeated the argument, but a defeater in the technical philosophical sense for the argument. Now that's the first response that I was gonna, because you made 2 points. So that was the first response I was gonna give. It seems as though what you said about the distinction or different properties flowing from distinction, I think that sort of helps bolster this primitive case. But that was the first response. The second response is that you were talking about how it's sort of equivocating when we're calling them both God. And you gave the example of like the lion, and we can say that the lion and you are both men, but the lion clearly, that we're just using that equivocally. Now I guess maybe I just need some further clarification, because I'm not quite seeing that point, right? Because we are saying that both of them have a divine nature. It's just that they're not identical to that. Remember when we were talking about that nature, they're not both identical to that nature, but nevertheless, it's still the case that they both have a divine nature, right? Whereas in the case of the lion and you, the lion doesn't have the nature of a man and you do. I know, and I think these two actually kind of play into each other, the two criticisms that I'm giving, because yes, they both have the divine nature and hence it's not equivocal. And how can there be two? Well, it's primitively distinct, which is supported by what we were just talking about with the sort of different properties.
Okay. Yeah, let me address the first point first. I guess, right. So your point there is, look, the natures can be primitively distinct. And because the natures can be primitively distinct, the gods who are identical to those natures can be distinct. and that defeats the argument I gave earlier. I guess, I mean, in a certain sense, you found a way around the argument. That's right. My reply is like, look, yeah, but you don't want to get out of the argument that way, right? Because, well, the reason I listed before, right? I mean, either it's going to be a brute fact that the natures are distinct, or one nature is going to be prior to the other, or, as I think you're suggesting here, there's going to be some third nature of which both of these divine natures are a species. Now, what suggests that to me in what you said is that you said they both have divine natures, right? Okay, so what makes both their natures divine? It would have to be their participation in some higher genus of divinity, right? And then I just point back to what I said before. Well, I mean, if that genus carries with it, if belonging to that genus means that both of these divine natures are personal, right? They both have intellect and will, then it seems like that genus is itself endowed with intellect and will, and we're on our way to start saying that that genus is in fact the real God. It's the higher God, of which these guys are just lower species. This actually connects with why classical theists have traditionally said that God does not belong to any genus. We don't want to have anything like that, where we're saying that God participates in some kind of higher nature, much less saying that there's multiple gods who participate each in some higher genus, right? Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, it's just interesting to me that we've very organically come to this point that Aristotle and Aquinas, each in their own way, insist on. And sorry, okay, I've lost track of what the
yeah, no, I was gonna ask how much time we have.
Yeah. About 4 minutes left.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, no, I like what you said there. I'll just maybe build on that a little bit. So I guess the critic of the argument. Well, I want to help the audience also just keep in mind the nature of this criticism, right? So this isn't an argument. Keep in mind that we're not discussing an argument against classical theism, right? I just want to help the audience understand the dialectical context. The dialectical context is one wherein we're looking at an argument that classical theism is a very secure way to or a very good way to secure monotheism. And then we're looking at one path of sort of criticism of this kind of argument, that classical theism is a very secure way of getting us to this monotheism. And so I want people to recognize that we're not sort of trying to like poke holes in classical theism simpliciter, and we're not trying to argue against classical theism simpliciter, because I can see different people like might be thinking that perhaps. So I did want to get that out of the way first. The second thing is that I do think that the critic of the argument could simply resist one of the things you said there, Christopher, by way of response, which was this, that if they both have a divine nature, then they are both participating in some higher genus. So I think they might just challenge that inference from if they both have this, if in some sense they both have something that is divine, then there's something that they're sort of sharing in, and they're both participating in this higher thing. I think the critic of the argument will simply just resist that inference, and they say, no, you don't have to have, when you have these two divine beings, you don't have to have this further thing, which is divinity, that they both participate in. That was sort of the whole point of positing the sort of primitive distinctness between them, it seems to me. So I guess they would just resist that inference. And I know they're like, now we're getting to the metaphysics of participation, and we're starting to get into the weeds now, but I guess we're probably at like a minute and a half or 2 minutes left. I guess I'll just turn it over.
Yeah, 2 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. All I have to say about that, I guess, is, yeah, if you go that way, then you owe us an explanation about why the two distinct natures each count as a divine nature, right? You're using that adjective. There should be some kind of explanation about why they each count as a divine nature as opposed to any other kind of nature. And to go back to realism, right? I mean, the traditional realist way of explaining that is by way of participation in some higher nature belonging to a genus, of which these are both species. These lower natures are both species. Right, I mean, you could go nominalist about divinity, but again, that starts to sound like a concession to me. Did we want to actually? Do we have time for me to say something about how you want to secure? How you want to secure uniqueness using perfect being theology?
Oh
Or
yeah,
no?
like the different pathway that, because we've only focused on this one pathway, right? And there's
Yeah.
this whole other pathway.
I mean, we have like 40 seconds left, to be honest. Do you want me to
Well,
extend or?
it's up to you, Joe. You're the one pressed for time.
Yeah, I can go about like I mean it's fine if we go like 5 minutes over. So I mean
Okay.
let's just go a little bit longer for us going on this point.
I'll
Okay.
get this out hopefully very quickly, and then I just get your response on it. So, right, in your blog post, you said that to get necessary uniqueness, all we would have to add is something like necessary uniqueness is a perfection / great making property. And I guess here's why I don't think that's going to be sufficient. It's one thing to say that a property is great making, and quite another to explain what God must be like in order to have that property. Omniscience, for example, is a great making property. I think we all agree on that. But obviously, that just saying that it's a great making property doesn't explain for us, what God must be like to be a knower at all, let alone omniscience. Otherwise, we wouldn't have whole treatises written on the divine omniscience and what God has to be like in order to be omniscient. Perfect being theology, as I take it, is a procedure for deciding what attributes we would expect God to have given his perfection. It's not an explanation for what he must be like in order to have those attributes. And at any rate, I think it's very weird to say that necessary uniqueness is a great making property because it's entirely it's entirely extrinsic to God, for starters, right? God is unique, or not true, not just God. Anything is unique in virtue of what else doesn't exist. Now, that fact is itself grounded in the divine nature, I think. But just by itself, uniqueness seems like if it's great making, it's only great making in virtue of other great making, more fundamental great making properties. And I think it seems wrong, therefore, to say that God, it also seems wrong to say that God is great because he's unique. It rather seems right to say that he's unique because of his greatness. He's so great that his very nature, and in particular his identity with that great nature, rules out the possibility of another being like him, in certain ways.
No, yeah, no, I like those responses. Those are wonderful. They definitely serve the dialectic. So one thing that I want to say in response to the first point is just that I think I agree, right? I agree that it wouldn't, precisely because perfect being theology is a method, right? It wouldn't sort of provide a sort of ontological explanation of God's uniqueness. It would actually, what I was trying to do was help us secure, help us to deduce and infer that under non-classical views of God, even under sort of perfect being neoclassical theist conception of God, right, we could still secure monotheism and be completely confident in that. I wasn't really trying to provide an explanation for it to begin with. I agree that precisely because it's a method, right, perfect being is a method, perfect being theology is a method, we can't really explain it in virtue of that, but we can secure it in virtue of that, and we can deduce it in virtue of that. That's what I think. And then the second thing you said was it doesn't seem to be great making because it's wholly extrinsic. Now, one thing that I want to say in response to that is like, man, the stupid fly. I could probably agree with that conditionally for now, and then let's focus on a different great making property that I mentioned in the blog post, which was even the neoclassical theistic God is the ground of all possible concrete objects, right? And so it is precisely in virtue of the neoclassical theistic God's causal power that anything could be possible and could branch off from his own creative bestowal of being to them as well, right? And if that's the case, well, then there couldn't be two of these, and there couldn't be two of these types of gods, because then, like the possibility one would sort of be in virtue of the causal power of the other, whereas the possibility of this one would be in virtue of the causal power of the other one, so we get a sort of vicious circularity. I explain this better in the post, but and I do think that that's going to be a much more intrinsic kind of property, and it's also very plausibly great making and adding to the perfection of something if it's the source and ground of all possible being, in virtue of its causal power, in virtue of its robust metaphysical necessity and its causal power for other things. So I guess those are my two responses to that. It was just I agree that it doesn't explain, but it does help us secure it, right? And so that's really all I was trying to do. And then the second one is just that I can conditionally grant that it's an extrinsic and hence not great making property to be necessarily unique, but we can actually deduce necessary uniqueness from another intrinsic great making property, namely being the sort of ground, the causal ground of everything apart from itself.
Yeah, there's like a minute left if you want to take it.
Well, I don't want to keep having the last word. I mean, I'm happy to end it there in the
Okay.
Okay,
interest of
we can go on.
dialectical fairness.
Yeah.
Unless you want me to reply, Joe.
I think we're fine. We can go
Okay.
on to the next.
Okay.
Yeah. So the last
I
two
think-
top. Sorry.
Well, let me just say, I think just by way of diagnosis, I think what we're disagreeing on there is what we mean by secure. But yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah. So the last two topics on the roster are one, divine simplicity and extrinsic change, and then second, divine simplicity and the hypostatic union. I have Christopher presenting first on both of these. I hope everyone's okay with that. All right. Well, Christopher, explain to us the extrinsic change and divine simplicity.
Yeah, I asked Swan to put this on the agenda because I was triggered by Joe's video with Ryan about this. And in particular, because I think it's just the one particular claim is quite obviously false in light of the way that classical theists cash out extrinsic change and the broader Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics. And that claim was that God can't even undergo extrinsic or Cambridge changes. I think that is, first of all, certainly false, right? I mean, if that ended up being true, that would be a huge problem for divine simplicity, because God undergoes a Cambridge change every time his creatures change.
Because he's really related to them.
Right. Now, why is it? So it seemed like Ryan and Joe agreed, I guess, in the video, right, that God couldn't undergo even an extrinsic change because even an extrinsic change would posit in God a before and after, right? Before that change happened to him and after that change happened to him. And that's what I want to deny, right? Precisely because the change is extrinsic, i.e. not a change in God, i.e. a change actually fully grounded in creatures alone, the before and after is only in the creatures. Now, it's true that for creatures, it becomes true. What was previously false of God becomes true, such as, for example, before the incarnation, it was false of God that he was incarnate. And after the incarnation, which we're going to talk about more after this 15-minute segment, after the incarnation, it's true of God that he's incarnate, that he's man, or just to use a more pedestrian example, right? I mean, it's before I was born or conceived, rather, it was false of God that he was the creator of Christopher. And after I was conceived, it was true of God that he is the creator of Christopher. But the thing is, just because God appears in the subject place of those predications does not mean that the change that grounds the truth of those predications, and in particular, the change from false to true, has to be in God, right? That's part of the whole idea about extrinsic change or Cambridge changes, is that you have some kind of predicate that goes from being false of a subject to true of a subject, or true of a subject to false of a subject, but not in virtue of anything that happens to that subject, entirely in virtue of something that happens to some other subject, right? So I think the really important point here is you can have predications where God appears as the subject term, and that predication goes from false to true in virtue of some extrinsic or Cambridge changes. And yet, what grounds that change in truth value, what grounds the truth of the predication that was previously true or now true, whichever direction it's going, is the new feature in creatures. And I think that's all you need, right? There, you don't have to posit a before and after in God. You don't have to posit any real relation in God to his creatures. You don't need any of that, right? All you need to explain why God went from not being the creator of Christopher to being the creator of Christopher is the fact of my conception, which is entirely extrinsic to God. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Yeah. Okay. No, that's good. So, I identified it as the claim, right? The claim is that God cannot undergo a Cambridge change, and you said that seemed to you obviously false, and I'm going to be a bit cheeky and say that to me it seems obviously true, right? So the way we defined classical theism, or not classical theism, the way we defined Cambridge change in the video, we explicitly define it at the start, and so I can call that a stipulative definition or whatever. But
Okay.
we defined it in the video, right? We said it's going from standing in relation R to not standing in relation R. Right? Going from
Okay.
standing in relation R to not standing in relation R.
Sure.
Now, it simply follows deductively from the no real relations doctrine that God doesn't stand in real relations with creation. It simply follows from that he doesn't go from standing in relation R to not standing in relation R. And hence it simply follows from that God cannot undergo Cambridge change as we explicitly define it in the video. And so it does seem to me obviously true that God cannot undergo Cambridge change as we define it in the video. Now we're getting into sort of definitional. That's sort of where I can see you're probably going to push back. Because now, I mean, we have to talk about these certain mixed relations, right? So it's real on the part of creatures and logical or mental or unreal on the part of God, right? So the change in creation, it's not a sort of change in God or what have you, and it's not even God standing in different relations to the creatures because God stands in no real relations with creatures. Rather, it's creatures changing their different relations to the creator and the creatures themselves changing. So we agreed with that. We agree with that in the video, and I think what you're saying is, I just think that it might ultimately be terminological because we defined Cambridge change, right? And we talked about the no real relations doctrine, and we even, we quoted like Lombard and Aquinas and all those people, and yeah, I mean, even there is also precedent in the classical theistic tradition. I wish I had the quote with me, but I think it was Lombard, but someone was just like, no, we can't even say that it doesn't signify God or his substance when we're predicating creature of him. It doesn't even signify a true signification of God or God's substance. And so I'm not sure if you can even have that. I think you'd have to do some major linguistic revision if you're trying to say, oh, well, God's the predicate, and we're saying it is genuinely true that God is creator, right? This is sort of denied by Lombard and others. If we're truly treating God as the sort of subject, and then we're predicating this creator or Lord or what have you of God, right? That is, I think we outlined a quote in there that at least one or more of the classical theistic tradition is explicitly denying that sort of true signification. Rather, it sort of signifies it's logical on the part of God, right? So we're not actually truly, really identifying something God. We're just talking something about creation. So it does seem to me that this will probably end up being terminological. So that was my first point in response. And then there's just one other point that I have in response. And it's just that I agree that in and of itself, right, this sort of Cambridge change thing, that God can't undergo Cambridge change as we defined it, right? God can't undergo Cambridge change. I do think that in and of itself doesn't pose a problem for classical theism, right? That's fine. That's just the no real relations doctrine. But then we proceeded to talk about different ways that we might try to tease out different problems in relation to that. So I think one of them, and I know this wasn't on the plan for this, but really briefly, one of them, just for the audience, was basically omniscience and changing God's changing knowledge of a changing world, right? And so really, if we want to say that that's completely grounded, it's only like even logically, it's like not even a real relation to God. It's completely grounded and completely true in virtue of everything about creation. Then it seems to me that in what sense is this God's knowledge changing, right? I mean, these are wholly extrinsic facts. I mean, it would literally be like Pluto's coming into existence or going out of existence. It seems as though now we're just not even talking about God's divine knowledge. And so that we basically, I agree that the mere fact of the Cambridge change thing, that wouldn't pose any problems for classical theism, and how we defined it is true. But we proceeded to tease out maybe different objections that you could base on the basis of that. So that's my main response.
Okay. So what's my time, Swan? On this?
6.5 minutes.
Okay, great. So yeah, okay, right. Given the stipulated definition, I agree. Yeah, of course, it deductively follows God can't undergo changes of that type. I just don't know why. I mean, I just don't know why you would characterize extrinsic changes, right? It's right there in the title, extrinsic, as changes that require God to go from standing in one relation to standing in another. because of course, if that's what it required, it wouldn't be extrinsic. It would be intrinsic.
So we mean the relation is the relation is not a sort of intrinsic, like I'm identical to myself, and in some sense that's a relation intrinsic to me, or like I think about my stomach, right? Like that's somewhat of a relation like inside of me. But whereas if there's some sort of, it's extrinsic in virtue of it makes reference, it signifies something apart from the thing, and it's a sort of a relation between that thing and me, and in that sense it's extrinsic, right? It's not like grounded fully in my being or what have you. So sorry to interrupt, I just wanted to add that.
That's good. So, right, I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is, look, you don't even need that, right? You don't even really need God to go from standing in from not standing in the creator relation to standing in the creator relation, if you characterize the creator relation as a real one in God, which we don't. And of course, the examples you just gave of identity or thinking about another thing, well, the identity one at least, is quite famously an example of a relation that Aquinas says is not real, even in creatures. It's not. So if you're talking about relations like that, then they might not turn out to be real, in which case, fine, okay, characterize extrinsic change in God in terms of God going from not standing in those relations to standing in them, so long as they're not real. So I guess, let me talk about the Lombard thing. I'm not a Lombard scholar, so I don't know what part of Lombard you're referring to. I would be very surprised to find out that he thinks extrinsic or Cambridge changes in God require God to go from not standing in some real relation to standing in some real relation. I mean, we just have to get to the text on that. So given the terminological difference, I guess the real important question here is like, okay, what do we really think we need real relations for in God to account for? And it seemed like your answer to that was, well, it seems like certain things we want to say about God require us to posit the real relations in him, say, going from not being a creator to being a creator when the world comes into existence.
Yeah, that one I'm not too sure about. That Ryan's really big on that one. I don't know. I'm not entirely certain on that one. I like to go with knowledge because it seems to me, I don't know, creator, like that seems to be some sort of like, I don't know, extrinsic designation. But when we talk about knowledge, it seems as though in some sense we're talking about God, or at least a relation that God stands in. So I just wanted to interject that I'm not actually sure about that creator one.
All right. So let me just, I guess, address the general point. So I mean, it seems to be, it's not like universally true that when you have a change in the truth value of a proposition where S stands in the subject place of that proposition, that the change in truth value requires some change in S. I mean, that's kind of like the whole intuition behind there being Cambridge changes, is that there are changes like that, where there can be a change in the truth value where S is in the subject place without any change in in S. And that's just a fact about the flexibility of language, right? It's really easy to just switch the direct object or subject of a proposition around and end up with a proposition that's equally true. So one way of putting this is, right, like, well, what you're really saying, that the most proper way of saying that God is a creator is to say that creatures are created by God, right? And so you could treat it as a kind of circumlocution, but certainly this is like, I think true, right? That there are changes like this, right? The tree outside my window goes from not being thought about me to being thought about me when I look out at it and start to think about it. And I mean, it would be really implausible to think that's some kind of real change in the tree, but nevertheless, you've had a real change in the truth value of the proposition the tree is thought about by Christopher. So that's enough to defeat as a universal claim that you can have no change in the truth value of a proposition in which S stands in the subject place without a change in S. So then we would need some kind of further metaphysical theory about why certain kinds of predications we want to make about God do require the change. That's where you bring in knowledge. So one thing I think you got wrong there is that classical theism does not say that God's knowledge is wholly grounded in the extrinsic facts. after all, we think it's in virtue of intrinsic features of God that he can know anything at all, right?
Yeah, I was
God
specifying one model. I wasn't saying classical
okay.
theism is committed. I was just specifying
Sure.
one model. Yeah.
Right. Okay. So, I mean, let me give what I think is the right model, and we can see what you say about that. Right. There's a big difference between God and a rock, and the difference is, among other things, that God is a knower. God has an intellect, and that's obviously in virtue of intrinsic features about God. Namely, in part, that God is a spirit. Part of what makes him able to. That's what makes him able to know. The claim is rather that contrastive facts about God's knowledge, that God knows that Christopher exists rather than knowing that Christopher doesn't exist. Those contrastive facts about the divine knowledge are wholly grounded in the extrinsic facts. And so, I mean, I suspect what you're going to say is like, okay, that's still a little too unknowledgy for me. It doesn't sound enough like knowledge. But I mean, even creaturely knowledge is extrinsic. When I know, for example, that Donald Trump is the president, that's not wholly intrinsic to me, because part of knowledge is truth. And the truth of my belief that Donald Trump is the president is entirely extrinsic to me. This is part of what leads to the Didier problem. Is there's no way for creatures to secure that bridge, to make a bridge that you can always be sure about between the truth and the intrinsic mental state. So, and extrinsicality is one way of characterizing extrinsicality would be to say, like, any part of something is extrinsic, the whole thing is extrinsic, right? We only want to designate as intrinsic what's entirely intrinsic. So it's fair under that definition of extrinsic to say, well, creaturely knowledge is extrinsic too, because it involves truth, and truth is extrinsic.
Yeah, so we're out of time actually on that one. I could increase it by 5 minutes and take that 5 minutes from the hypostatic union section, or just move on.
Entirely up to Joe. I'm free on time.
We can move on. That's fine with me. Yeah, I mean, obviously, like, I'm really interested in the sort of intrinsic, extrinsic models of divine knowledge. William Matthews Grant and so on. Like, I interact with that a lot and so on. So I do have a lot to say, but I think we can go on. It's fine with me to let that sit for now.
All right, and for the final section, discussing the hypostatic union and divine simplicity, Christopher, take it away.
Great. So this is really just a special application, I think, of what I've said before. But it's important. It's an important application because, of course, our Christology is central to our faith, and errors in our Christology would be devastating to the Christian faith in general. So it's important that we get the application right here. Right. What I remember Ryan saying in the video that you had with him on extrinsic change, Joe, was that one of the things, right, is that, look, if if the Word's being in union with his human nature, i.e. the incarnation, consists only not in any real relation of the Word to his human nature, but only in a real relation of the human nature to the Word, then you are left without any way of explaining what the difference is between me and Jesus, because, hey, look, God's not in any real relation with me either. It's only true that I am in a real relation with God, and then it looks like you can't. There's nothing special about the hypostatic union. There's nothing special about Jesus in distinction to any other man. We're all in real relations with God. There's something very easy to say about this to defeat this point, namely that the kind of relation that the human nature of Christ bears to the Word is very, 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 very different from the real relation that I bear to the Word, right? The real relation that I bear to the Word is of creature to creator, of redeemed to redeemer, of saved to savior, and a host of other things, everything God has done for me. Now it's true that it's true that the human nature of Christ also shares in some of those real relations to God that I just mentioned. God, for example, it does share in the creature-creator relation. God is the creator of the human nature of Christ. But there's also another real relation, right? And this is an important point, I guess, especially for the audience to note. When we say that God doesn't stand in real relations to creatures, but creatures stand in real relations to God, we're not putting any cap on the number of real relations that any given creature could have to God. It could be a whole lot, right? In fact, every fact about a creature is going to ultimately find its ontological foundation in some real relation born to God, because all of a creature's being comes from God. So, right, the human nature of Christ bears the creature-creator relation to the Word, but it also bears this other really important relation to the Word that no other creature does, namely that of hypostatic union, in virtue of which it comes to constitute, together with the divine nature of the Word, one person. That's not true of any other human. That's not true of any other human creature or creature whatsoever. So yeah, it seems to me that that's sufficient to secure all the facts about Orthodox Christology, and so there's no special problem here for classical theism.
Yeah, no, I'm actually just trying to pull up. Well, my internet's a bit too, well, maybe it's loading. I'm actually trying to pull up our show notes for that, because he actually did consider that, right? He said, okay, well, the main response that classical theists will give is just that while the relation between the Son and the human nature is a logical relation, classical theists will respond by saying that the relation between Jesus's human nature is that of being hypostatically united to the Son, right? And so he is actually aware of this. So I think that we both talked about how that of course there's a difference in kind between my relation to God and Jesus's relation to the second person of the Trinity, or I guess I should say my relation to the second person of the Trinity. So that's the first thing that I wanted to say, is that he did address that, and then he went on to talk about how this would lead to essentially just a linguistic revision. So that's one objection that he leveled. So there are basically two objections after he leveled that response to the argument on behalf of the classical theist, right? He went on to give two objections, basically. The first one was that basically just an appeal to intuition. And so again, I'm not going to take a stance on how powerful both of these responses are. I'm just going to outline their responses.
I don't mean to make you speak for Ryan. Tell me what your objections are. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I haven't studied Christology, and I'm not a Christian, so I can't really. Okay. I don't really have a dog too much.
I guess your objections to if Christianity, your objections to assuming Christianity, what's wrong with this account?
Well, okay, so let me just outline his two responses, and well, I'll say that I find them mildly plausible, and so I guess I would say I lean towards thinking that these two responses are prima facie good responses to this response on behalf of the classical theist. So the first one is basically just an appeal to intuition, right? So it just seems implausible that the human nature of Christ has this really tight-knit relation to the second person of the Trinity, namely being hypostatically united to this second person of the Trinity, but yet this second person of the Trinity, it's not the other way around. Like, it doesn't have this really tight-knit property of being hypostatically united to the human nature. So it's sort of just an appeal to intuition. Like, and then in what sense is it really an incarnation? Like, usually when we talk about how the incarnation, we want to say like the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, right? The Word became flesh, right? It's like God assuming the human nature. It's not like and this bleeds into the second criticism, which is linguistic revision. Instead, we'd have to like do this whole scale revision, say, well, actually, it's not the Word becoming flesh; it is the flesh becoming such that it is related to the Word, or it's not God becoming man; it is man such that it is gaining this property of being hypostatically united to God, or it's not God assumed a human body. No, it's a human body is such that it stands in this relation of being assumed by to the second person of the Trinity, or what have you. And so it's a sort of linguistic revision plus an appeal to intuition. And like, ultimately it might just bottom out like, yeah, this is just a commitment of classical theism and it's not incoherent. And so and I mean, Ryan might have other arguments for incoherence, but we didn't talk about those in the video. So it might just bottom out and just be like, yeah, I mean, that's just a commitment of classical theism. It might seem counterintuitive, but that's kind of just a commitment. And it's just, that's what happens when God doesn't stand in logical relations to things. So that's really where I'm at on this whole topic.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So let me say a little bit about that. So I guess the important word here, right, is union. And your first objection, or you the Ryan's objection that you find intuitively plausible to some degree, is that well, you know, it's not really a tight-knit union or a hypostatic union if it's a union if the word isn't being moved or related to the human nature of Christ in any way. And it, right, I mean, right. So the key word there is union. Unions are instances of things coming close together in some sense or another, right? But I mean, it seems obvious with every other case of a union, at least, that unions can be achieved with movement or relation only on one side, right? So my wife is downstairs right now. If I wanted to go hold her hand, there's two ways to accomplish that. I could walk downstairs and grab her hand and she doesn't have to move at all, right? And vice versa, she could come up here and hold my hand, and we would be in a kind of union where obviously only one of us has moved, only one of us has changed their real relation to the other. So it just, yeah, I guess I'm just not seeing the force of the point that unions require movement or real relation on both sides. Unions are about coming together, and you can come together by having either side move toward the other. Now, I guess about revision, you said, well, look, you know, obviously, the core of Christian doctrine is that the Word became flesh. And this is where I guess it's important to note that what we're saying now about the hypostatic union is just an application of what came before about extrinsic change and the doctrine of divine simplicity in general, right? We can have propositions that change in truth value where S appears in the subject place without any real change in S, right? And I think that's fine. We do that all the time, right? And that's why I think there's nothing revisionary about saying that when we say the Word became flesh, we're only speaking really of movement of the human nature of Christ to the Word, precisely because we speak this way all the time about all other kinds of movements and so on. That's not a revision to our language, right? Just the tree goes from not being thought about by Christopher to being thought about by Christopher. That, I mean, to say that it's a revision of our linguistic practices would require us to think that we don't put we don't think that propositions change in truth value with S in the subject place without any change in S, and we, as a general principle at least, we don't think that that's the case. That's not our linguistic practice. Our linguistic practice is to think that propositions can change truth value in that way without any real change in S. So further elaboration on that point is just to note that I think all Christians are going to have to accept that, not just because of the common sense point, as I hopefully illustrated with my tree example, but also because all Christians who are orthodox about their Christology are going to have to accept the communicatio idiomata. The idea that we say things about Christ, and not just about Christ, but about God, since Christ is God, that certainly are not true in virtue of any kind of change or real relation in the divine nature. For example, it's Orthodox Christology to say that Christ died and therefore that God died. It's heretical to deny this in Christianity. And yet it's also heretical to say that what grounds the truth of the proposition that God died is anything in the divine nature. And that's going to, and I think, you know, people who deny divine simplicity should be able and willing to accept both of those propositions of Orthodox Christianity, regardless of divine simplicity, right? Note that the example I just gave has nothing to do with divine simplicity, right? You just say, Christ is God, Christ died, therefore God died, but God died is not true in virtue of anything concerning the divine nature. That argument, right, doesn't rest in any way, shape, or form on the doctrine of divine simplicity or any other article of classical theism. It's just straight out of Orthodox Christology. And once you have that, then, you know, what's supposed to be the principled objection to the classical theist saying that the word became flesh is true in the same way.
No, yeah, that's good. I mean, we're coming close to out of time, so I'll basically just give maybe a 60-second response. Maybe knowing myself, it'll probably be like 120 seconds. But so the first one, I mean, the first thing that I just want to say by way of response is that I'm not quite sure your example of you and your wife holding hands. Although it was touching, I'm not sure if it was perfectly successful and adequate, really, because, you know, in order to be successful, it would really have to be like your wife's hand stands in the relation of being held by you, or like holding your hand, but your hand doesn't stand in relation of being held by her hand. It would be something like that. And that now we're starting to get, like, it seems a little bit more implausible, right? Like, I know you had to, like, you either had to walk towards her or she had to walk towards you. But what the relation really was, like, the holding of the hands. I think it'd be like a better or maybe more accurate, or maybe a more intuitive way to get people's intuitions pumping is like, thinking about Socrates or something like that, or like thinking
Sure.
about something, right?
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, like, I'm, in what sense is that really like this tight union between me and Socrates if I'm just like sort of thinking about Socrates, and like Socrates doesn't even know that I exist, for instance, or something. Like, I'm not really, it seems at least somewhat intuitive, right? And again, I don't really, that I'm not like in this tight-knit relationship with him or what have you. So again, like that's just the first response. And again, like, I don't like claim that this is some sort of decisive objection. Again, like I said, these are very mild leanings that I have.
Sure.
My focus, I don't really focus on Christology, as you know. I'm more of like a metaphysics person. But the second thing, and I know I probably like 30 more seconds. Like,
You have
I
a
agree.
minute, don't worry.
Okay. I agree in like much more generally, or much more broadly. Like we have to keep in mind this like linguistic quote unquote revision, right? Where there's this subject and we can sort of transpose the subject and the direct object or whatever, and it'll still be kind of perfectly natural. But I was thinking about sort of revision in a sort of very explicitly theological sense. And so it'd be more so like a theological revision and not focusing on broad linguistic facts. And so like really prima facie, there's like a defeasible presumption, it seems, in favor of treating theological statements just on their face, how they seem. And on its face, when we say that the word became flesh, prima facie, it just seems we're saying something about the word. We're saying something, that's what, like if you ask a normal person, are you saying that the word genuinely became flesh? You know, they're probably going to say, yeah, like that just seems true.
I do too. We are saying something about the word.
Well, yeah, well, becoming flesh, I mean, that's really the bit, right? Because you're saying it's a logical relation on the part of the word, which is really just in our minds, right? Instead, you would have to say that the flesh is such that it became really related to the word, whereas the word didn't become really related to the flesh or what have you. And so really, I do think it's going to pose at least some revisionism, and we're at least going to have to treat some things that on their face seem prima facie plausible, and we're just going to have to, you know, kind of reject that prima facie plausibility, which isn't a devastating objection. I mean, it's just sort of, I'm just trying to outline some of Ryan's criticisms, but I don't know, we're probably out of time. And
yeah. Well, gentlemen, thank you for this wonderful conversation. Thank you for your patience and just a really great job. I think you kind of, I think you blew it out of the water, and I think I'm going to have a great time just listening and thinking about these points again. And I'm excited, Joe, for your conversation with Gavin Kerr. That'll be coming up soon. Thank you once again, gentlemen. That's the end of the episode. Have a great day, guys.
thank you.
Thanks, Juan.